yes, this morning's session about behaviour in teams, and in particular, can we improve what happens in team meetings? And because this is itself a big team project, I think I need to start by acknowledging everyone else who's played a part in this research. Well, not everyone else, because this is really a large core team that's been working on this for the last 5 years. Neil Rackham, who's also funded a lot of the research, Rod Nicholson, who is now at Edge Hill University, Rose Everson as a independent research fellow, and then these other 7 members of the team. I won't run through them name by name, but who have worked within the management school at some point over the last few years and been critical in producing what I'm talking about today. So what am I talking about? Well, we talked about behaviour in teams, and specifically we're thinking about team meetings. And when I say team meetings, you might automatically think of a setting a bit like this. This is how, until earlier this year, I would have naturally thought of team meetings. These days, they may be more like this, where we're seeing things online. And what happens in team meetings might differ a little bit between the left-hand side of the screen and the right-hand side of the screen, but essentially, they're still really fundamental parts of how teams work together. And there's been a lot of research which has shown that one of the real keys to successful team outcomes is the sharing of information, sometimes referred to as information elaboration. Teams can't be as innovative as they should be, they can't be as effective as they could be, and they won't be as enjoyable places to work without adequate sharing of information. So that's one of the real drivers behind what we want to accomplish with this project. So I'll just say a little bit about what the project is all about. We actually started this, and in fact we've done a lot of it, in relation to student teams and how people learn at universities. One of the things is that whereas 20, 30 years ago, people might think of the main purpose of getting a degree as to acquire knowledge, these days, knowledge can be seen more as a commodity. A lot of things we can understand or find out about just with Google or another search engine. And there are so many different ways of acquiring knowledge these days that university education isn't necessarily the most important part of that. But universities do traditionally teach, test, and certify knowledge, but they also do other things. And in particular, one of the things that can really set universities apart these days is by doing equivalent things for not knowledge, but skills. One of those skills that is particularly valued by employers is team working. So we began this project 5 years ago with the aim to develop student teamwork skills at the University of Sheffield. Now, teamwork at universities is very commonplace, and employers have been placing an increasing importance on skills, including creativity, communication, and teamwork over recent years. When employers are looking at potential recruits, they will often ask those who apply for jobs about their experience in team working, and very often applicants will refer to what happened at university when they're early in their career. But in reality, universities often don't do very much to support the development of teamwork skills. They put students in teams to work together, and they might think that that teaches them how to work in teams, but actually there's not a lot of evidence for that. It's certainly not the case that just by putting people in teams, they will naturally learn how best to work in teams. So they need some information about that. They need some opportunity to practice, and they need some feedback. So why is giving feedback important? Well, this is the point at which, if I were giving this talk in person, I'd probably ask someone, a volunteer, to come up and draw on the whiteboard or whatever we had in the room, 30-centimeter line. And if I ask someone to draw a 30-centimeter line and say, okay, that's not very good, can you draw another one? They won't know how it's not very good. If I say to them, that's a bit too long, they'll know to draw it a bit shorter. But it's a bit too short, they'll know to draw it a bit longer. But simply knowing that they haven't done it very well isn't really enough for them to be able to practice how to do it better. And that's a very simplistic example, but the same applies to so many skills, including teamwork. So we've been using what we call the behavior in teams, or BIT methodology. And this uses a version of behavior analysis that was developed initially by Neil Rackham and his colleagues, starting, in fact, when he was a PhD student at Sheffield, and then going on in his career after that, but back in the 1970s. And the principle behind this is that it enables people to code team verbal behaviors. In other words, when people say things in team meetings, someone can categorize what they've said into different, one of 15 different categories, and then immediate feedback on which categories have been used can be given after meetings. The categories are something that describes a verbal behavior in a way that can be changed. Categories are things that are mutually exclusive, so everything must fit into one and only one category, but they must also be meaningful so that people can react to them. And I'll say a bit more about what these categories actually are in just a moment. But the BIT methodology then can be used as part of a skills development training, either with students or with people in a workplace or elsewhere. And the fundamental principle of the feedback is that it's done on a short cycle, by which I mean people will have the team meeting, they're using various behaviors which are coded live, and I'll show you the coding in a few minutes, and then at the end of the meeting, feedback is given. And it's really important that there is this opportunity for feedback and indeed reflection on that feedback immediately after the meetings. And this contrasts widely with what's called long cycle feedback, which is when a meeting might be recorded, and then the recording taken away and studied and coded, and then feedback can be given to the teams the following week or a few months later, or whatever it is. That might give more potential for accurate feedback and making sure that things are really, really tight in terms of the categories and the coding. But actually, it's not very useful in terms of how teams learn. If you were drawing that 30-centimeter line on the whiteboard, someone says to you, that's a little bit too long, draw another one, you can do it straight away. If they come back to you a few weeks later and say, oh, that line you drew, that was a bit too long, it would be a bit more difficult to put that into practice straight away. So what about these behaviors? Well, what we've been using are 4 what we call meta categories. These are the meta categories. There's initiating discussions, reacting to people, and clarifying what's being said. Overlaying all of these is what we call process behaviors, which is about how people actually engage in the conversation and bring others into the conversation, etc. And the precise categories we use are these. So terms of process behaviours, they literally are things like bringing people into the conversation. If I were to ask one of you now what you thought about it, that would be an example of a bringing in behaviour. Or shutting out, interrupting people to stop them talking, which can be equally important. A lot of research has demonstrated links between the evenness of what we call airtime, the amount of time people are speaking in a team meeting, and the quality of information elaboration, sharing of information in that meeting, and subsequently the effectiveness of the teams. So having these bringing in and shutting out behaviors can actually be a very positive thing. It can often be thought that interrupting someone is a negative behavior, and sometimes it is, but that's not always the case. Lightening the mood is another behavior that people use just to not really progress the task, but to affect the morale of the team. Then we have initiating behaviors, and broadly these are proposing things and building on things that other people have proposed. Proposing includes both proposing procedures, so how we're going to run this meeting, how we're going to work as a team, but also proposing ideas, the actual content of what people are talking about. A lot of teams do a lot of proposing, but actually research has shown that some of the better teams are those that do far more building than proposing, actually taking other people's ideas and running with them. Then there's reacting behaviors, supporting ideas and supporting people, disagreeing with ideas, and the one thing which is probably more definitely a negative behavior, which is defending and attacking. Defending might not sound so negative when you put it like that, but usually within that there's some kind of implicit attack on someone else if you're having to defend a particular idea. Then there's various clarifying behaviors. These are actually the most common behaviors. So seeking information, be it task or personal, giving information, and one of the most useful things actually is checking and summarizing. So just making sure that people, make sure that you understand what has been said correctly and that others do as well. So that's our category system, and once you split out the task and personal information, that makes 15 categories, which is quite a lot to be able to code accurately, and I'll say a bit more about how we do that in just a few minutes. But I just want to say a bit more about what we've done in particular with student teams. So we've worked with well, over 500 teams over the last few years. A lot of them, the majority in fact, have been in the engineering faculty at the University of Sheffield. And some of those have been engaged on week-long team-based projects where they meet on a daily basis, and we've been able to track what happens over the course of the week. And we've often focused on some of these behaviours which are probably the easiest ones to make a difference to. So in particular, the first thing we always do with them is talk about how to promote equal contribution. So making sure that the airtime in the team is reasonably even. It doesn't have to be precisely even, but neither should it be dominated by one voice. So encouraging people to use bringing in behaviours, and also where appropriate, shutting out behaviours. And the next one we do after that is all about generating ideas. So participating, this would include proposing ideas and proposing procedures, but also in particular building on those. When we're working with hundreds of teams, as we do, it's impossible to coach each team individually. So what we've developed is a series of videos. These are roughly 30 minutes videos that teams will be shown usually at the beginning of a day, and it's an interactive video, so there'll be content where the narrator, in this case is Neil Rackham, talks about the features of a well-functioning team. There'll be demonstrations of teams displaying behaviours, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, sometimes neutral. And then there are opportunities to actually practice these behaviours in teams. The video will pause for 2 or 3 minutes to enable teams to have a go at trying to do things. And what we tend to do is measure how teams behave before seeing these videos, and then how they behave after the videos, to see how much difference they make. And the principal research question we've been asking is, does giving teams feedback on their behaviours leads to changes in behaviours in subsequent meetings, and then also to improved team outcomes? So it might sound like a reasonably straightforward question to ask, but in practice, it's quite a difficult thing to gather data on. And the key to this that has made this possible for us is a way of coding these behaviours. And one of our team members, Nick Jefferson, who I showed the photo of earlier, built on work. There's another one, Rob Nicholson did earlier, to create an app for an iPad, which does this coding, or enables a person, I should say, to do this coding. So what we see on the left-hand side here is a typical online meeting. We've got 5 of us there. You might just about be able to make me out in the top right-hand corner. This was something recorded a few months ago before Google Meet, which is what we often use at the university for meetings, enabled the individual, yourself, to be shown on the screen in equal ways. So there are 5 of us there. And what you see on the right-hand side is what the app would look like to the coder. So you can actually put in the 5 team members actually in the order that they appear on screen to make it easier to find them. And then while using the app, while observing the meeting, which should be done ideally in person, the observer will first of all see who says something. So if Carolyn says here, Rose, what would you suggest? First of all, the observer would click on the little Carolyn icon, which would bring up this set of the 15 behaviours, and then they can choose the behaviour that Carolyn was using here, in this case, bringing in. And just in practice, this is what it would look like. It's a reasonably straightforward thing to use. You can't see the meeting that's actually going on in the background here, so you can see what the clicking on the app looks like. But I will show you in just a minute a few minutes of an example meeting that we had. So this is the point at which I need to make sure that the technology is working as it really should be. So hopefully Mel will be able to confirm that if I start this video off, you can actually hear what's being said.
Now we're stuck here in each our little office, and we need to wait. I can hear it.
Fantastic, thank you. So what I'll do is I'll just play this video for a few minutes. It's not a particularly exciting meeting, I have to admit. It's a discussion that a few of us had a few weeks ago about an away day for IWP in the current circumstances. But I've superimposed on the bottom the behaviours that are being used, so you can see how this might happen in practice.
Now we're stuck here in each our little office, and we need an away day for the IWP. I'm anticipating that we will not be able to meet face to face, And I think we usually have really good group discussions, really constructive working, and getting some good output that we can work on once we get back to the university. So we probably won't be able to do that. So what I would like to discuss today is how can we plan the next IWPA, what should the topic be, and how can we plan it so it still becomes a good learning experience for everybody and we get some good output at the end. So the floor is open. Any particular wishes for our topics?
I think it would be good to reflect on maybe what's happened with COVID this year and some of the challenges and how we've overcome them, because I thought we've done a decent job. But you know, there's some things maybe we could have done better. What do people think?
Yeah, I think some hints and tips about finding space for writing and things like that might be quite helpful. And again, because every other part of our work seems to have expanded, you know, I think it would be quite useful to find maybe, I don't know, little hints and tips that different people have had, or examples people can give us about how they've managed their time, or they've given themselves time in their diary or whatever for doing research. Otherwise, it gets pushed to the back of the pile, doesn't it?
Yeah. But I don't know, I think that's a good idea, but I'm thinking whether we want to broaden it out and look at all stages of the research process. I've just been reviewing the grant applications for the Norwegian research body, and one of the problems we found there was that they had written COVID-19 into the grant applications, but of course it takes like 3 months before we see them. And one of the applications was all about, you know, now we're all going to work in the peopless office forever and ever and ever. And it's like, well, actually, in Norway, at least in the Scandinavian countries and in Germany, people have already returned. So I think it would be a good discussion to look at how do we write grant applications now to make them account for what's happening at the same time as make them timely and not outdated by the time that the review panel gets around to read them. I think it's also how can we collect data during COVID-19. So maybe it's an idea. I would like to hear your input on it, but we could have different points, different
Absolutely.
aspects of the research process throughout the day.
Yeah, the issue of collecting data is such a key one, because we're still obviously prevented from doing a lot of the face-to-face data collection that we might have done in the past. And I think that might be particularly problematic for some qualitative and ethnographic research. Rose, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been collecting any data at the moment, but yeah, I think it's definitely an issue in terms of particularly the ethnographic approaches. So if you're doing interviews, you can do them over Google Meet or Zoom or something, but to do some ethnography is really tricky. I've just reviewed an ethics application from one of the PhD students who's wanting to go into organisations and do some ethnographic observation, and they've had to rethink how they're going to do that, given that they're not allowed to go into the organisation now. So yeah, I think it introduces all sorts of new challenges in terms of how we do research and, like the Karina, how we acknowledge what's going on without sort of making it outdated by the time it's then come through to the review process or through to actually doing research.
Could I suggest, in the interest of time, we also have to think about how best we could manage this away day logistically? Are we going to use Google Meet? Are we going to use different software? Are we going to try and do it socially distanced?
I've been trying out more Google Jamboard recently.
I've used that.
Yeah, oh, good, I'm glad you've had a go at it as well, Reese. That's something we've all got access to because it's on Google Suite.
You'll like it, Karine. You do post-it notes. That was my next question.
Yeah. And it's a nice way of just doing, you know, you share a document like a Google Doc, but it's like a board, and you can write sticky post-its, stick them on a board, and then move them around and write around them. So it's a bit more visually interesting. So it could be useful to maybe do some of it on that. I've used another platform called Miro, where you do the video recording within the board itself. I don't think you can do that on the Google Jamboard. It's just a document. I suppose if we had this running, Google Meet side by side with the Jamboard, then we all talk and be writing on that at the same time.
That's a really interesting idea.
So you get the idea. I have to say that the actual coding of that, and there were probably one or two bits in the coding that you saw where it was there could have been a slightly different code applied in one or two cases, and where it was moving quite fast in the interest of showing showing you what was what, maybe missed one or two out. But broadly, this is what people would be sitting there doing on the iPad, and it takes a long time to train people to do that successfully. What we've been doing is having people do a sort of online session by themselves for 2 or 3 hours, followed by 2 days of actual in-person group training, which seems to be what it takes to get people to code things to this really reliable standard. So the people who are doing the coding are generally not experts, at least when they start the process, about behaviours and teams. But we've been using largely PhD students from across different parts of the university, many of whom have really become experts at this. But then at the end of the meeting, they will show, usually first of all, a graph like the one you see now showing airtime. And the dotted line you see down the middle is what it would look like if everyone was having completely equal airtime. So you may have picked up from the video that Karina was speaking a bit more than other people, which may be appropriate as she's the director of IWP, but in some circumstances that might be appropriate, in others it's not. The important thing is that when we give the teams feedback, we don't say that this was right or wrong. We give them the information and that they can reflect on whether that was right or wrong. We're effectively holding up a mirror so that they can see what they actually did in the meeting in different ways. Very often, when people see this airtime graph, they would react with surprise. Carolyn said, was I really only speaking for 10% at the time? Or Karina, was I really speaking for that much? And it's quite interesting seeing people's reactions when they get that. So we show them the graph about the airtime and then any other specific behaviours that they have been working on or they had the video about that day. So here's one about proposing, which brings together actually both proposing ideas and proposing procedures. They can be separated out depending on what's the most important thing. The app has been designed to be very flexible in that respect. So I've told you quite a lot about what we do and how we've done it, but I would like over the next few minutes just to share some of the results that we have found. Now, we could have, I could have showed you any number of different findings here. We've got enough results to fill several days worth of presentations. So I've decided to pick on one particular study that we've done over the last 2 years. It was all completed before lockdown, so it was all based on face-to-face meetings. And in this study, we were really trying to address 4 particular hypotheses. And basically the hypotheses were that when groups are given feedback, they change their behaviours and are more effective. So in particular, hypothesis 1 is talking about groups given feedback will have more even airtime than those not given feedback. Hypothesis 2 is about being able to use more bringing in and shutting out behaviours in later meetings compared with groups without feedback. Hypothesis 3 is using more building behaviours, and hypothesis 4 is being more generally effective in later meetings than teams not given feedback. And the sample that we used for this was from 62 teams enrolled in a semester-long team project, and these were students from engineering degrees who are in the final year of a 3 or 4 year study. 362 of them, so 3 or 4 year degree, I should say, 362 students in the study, and they were in teams of roughly 6 people each. A little bit of variation in that, but 6 was the most common number. And as part of this, they had 6 structured meetings in each team. And when I say structured meetings, they were given an overall task to design an engineering solution to a particular problem. And they were told that they needed to work through things in a particular order. So we had some equivalence between the teams in terms of what they would be discussing in each meeting. And they were coded by these trained observers, who, as I said, were largely PhD students. And 25 teams were given feedback between meetings. 37 weren't. The reason that's uneven is because it needs to fit in with the particular timetables that different students, different on different courses had. But then all the teams were debriefed at the end of the project. So the 37 teams who didn't get feedback along the way were given feedback in the end, so they would be less disadvantaged, possibly by the end of their degree. And we gathered all this data. We used various different types of analysis. For those of you of an analytical, technical or statistical mind, this might be interesting. For some of you who don't know what zero inflated negative binomial regression is, then I wouldn't worry about it too much. But we looked at evenness, calculated a standard deviation of the amount of time people spoke within the team, and then we looked at the actual numbers of behaviours or proportions of behaviours that people would use. We use proportions rather than numbers, largely because the length of team meetings wasn't unanimous between teams, and we would control for the sex and nationality of the students. In terms of airtime, then we did see the type of effect that we expected to. What we see in the graph here is on the left-hand side, we've got the teams who received feedback, and we've got on the right-hand side those teams that didn't. So it's interesting to see that there was a slight reduction, a not statistically significant reduction of unevenness of airtime. So in other words, teams becoming more even in the control group, but in the feedback group, this was significant. So we could say with a certain amount of confidence that when teams received feedback, they had more even airtime in subsequent meetings than those who didn't. And we see similar effects for bringing in and shutting out behaviours. In particular, bringing in increased significantly more in the feedback group. It did increase in the control group as well. Possibly that's because students are learning from these videos, even if they're not getting feedback on them. Likewise with shutting out, we saw more shutting out, a lot more shutting out coming in the feedback teams. So when teams receive feedback, they realise that maybe they're not doing enough shutting out, and that's contributing to the lack of evenness of people speaking. And they do something about it. In terms of building behaviours, remember I said earlier that some research has shown that building is so much more important than proposing ideas in terms of having successful team outcomes. Well, what we see is when teams receive feedback on this, they slightly increase their building behaviours compared with control groups. The control group who don't receive any feedback, where they actually use fewer building behaviours in subsequent meetings. So there's a definite effect there. And when we look at overall meeting effectiveness, which is measuring a whole range of different aspects of the meeting, we see a similar pattern, although actually statistically this isn't significant in this case. So effectiveness does appear to increase more in the feedback teams than in the control teams, but it's not a big enough difference in that change for us to be able to say that with statistical levels of high statistical levels of confidence. So as I say, that's really a flavour of the results, and we are writing various papers at the moment which will go into these results in a lot more detail. But I just want to finish the session by talking about what we can conclude overall and where we want to go next. So overall, we'd say that when team members are more aware of their behaviours, this helps increase behaviours that allow more information elaboration, allows more evenness of airtime, and in particular allowing more team members contribute to discussions. And we find this is particularly important in teams where there is a lot of cultural diversity. So one of the results I've not shown you today suggests that students who come from various different countries, but in particular China, where we've got a large student population, the feedback enables those students to contribute more to discussions than they would do without the feedback. Emphasizing the importance of building on others' ideas really helps improve these discussions, which in turn other results have shown lead to increased creativity in the teams. And there is some evidence that the effectiveness of meetings is improved by giving feedback, but that's not such strong evidence at the moment. Now, I just want to say a little bit what we want to do next, because unfortunately, we're now in a position where the funding we had for the 5 years, or nearly 5 years of this project, has ended. And while we were hoping that we might be able to continue that, the circumstances we find ourselves in with university finance and COVID and other factors have meant that hasn't been able to be extended. So it would be lovely to be able to say to you that we've got a team ready to work with anyone. As it happens at the moment, the team of researchers has gone their separate ways, and although still very much in contact with them and writing with them, we don't have a team of researchers ready to go and work with organizations, even though that's something we would like to do. So we are looking for funding which will help us to work with teams in organizations, so that we can carry on this work and find whether what we've discovered with student teams applies in the workplace as well. We've also got something I haven't really talked about, but another line looking at an artificial intelligence solution to this. One of the problems with doing what we have done is that it requires a lot of observers. And in particular, if these are observers who need to be trained and paid, this can end up being quite expensive. So one of our team members, Madida Hassan, has been looking at whether we can develop a machine learning system to automatically code what's happening in these meetings. And we've got somewhere along the way with that so far, but not in a state that's ready to be used more widely yet. There's a particular opportunity for that, perhaps with online meetings. We've all become so much more used to online meetings this year, certainly in the UK, and I suspect in many other parts of the world too. But online meetings maybe can be recorded in a slightly different way, and that might help with the automatic coding of them. But also there might be problems that arise with that as well, such as the lag, different people talking at different points, because they're not interrupting, but they just aren't aware that the other person was starting to speak at the same time. And also within the university, we've been talking to, in particular within the management school where we are, but other departments too, about how these skills can be embedded within student programs, so that the students who are the graduates of the future can go into the workplace knowing how best to use these team working skills and really help both their careers and the organizations and society more generally.